Hello everyone, Alan Sens here, and welcome to this video on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. So the NPT is pretty much the centerpiece of the non-proliferation regime, and that's why we're looking at it in a separate video all on its own. I really want to spend a little bit more time with this subject because it's so crucial. So let's get started. So here is the learning objective for this video. By the time we're done, you should be familiar with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you really should be able to describe the treaty in considerable detail to someone who is not familiar with it. Now, the motives behind this treaty are really quite interesting. There's kind of two grand motives from two different categories of states. For nuclear weapon states, that is to say, states that possessed nuclear weapons at the time, the motive was twofold. The first motive was fear. Fear of the further proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. In fact, in this period, it was believed that in 20 years, as many as 25 to 30 countries might have nuclear weapons. And that was thought to be extremely dangerous. And so the motive of nuclear weapon states was to prevent the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. They also then wanted to, create as many obstacles as they could to the efforts of any more countries to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, for non-nuclear weapon states, a little spelling mistake right there, that should be four. Non-nuclear weapon states, they had a different motive. Those countries wanted to acquire peaceful nuclear technology. I mean, many of them had no interest in developing nuclear weapons, but they wanted civilian nuclear power technology. And so their view going in was, well, if you expect us never to acquire nuclear weapons, we'll commit to that, but in return, we want you, the nuclear weapon states, with all this advanced technology, to help us benefit from peaceful nuclear energy applications. Furthermore, countries that didn't have nuclear weapons also wanted the commitment of nuclear powers to nuclear disarmament. They said, look, if you expect us to sign a treaty in which we commit to not acquiring nuclear weapons, we want you to commit in this treaty to actually disarming yourself of nuclear weapons at some point. So this was the mix of motives that went into the treaty. So here are some of the vital statistics of the treaty. Signed 1968, went into force with the necessary ratifications in 1970. The treaty initially was renewed every 5 years, so they'd hold this big review conference and renew the treaty for another 5 years. But at the 1995 review conference, the parties to the treaty just kind of said, look, this is kind of silly meeting every 5 years to renew the treaty. Why don't we just extend it indefinitely? And they actually agreed to that, so now the treaty is in indefinite extension. There's 189 parties to the treaty. That's very significant because it's a very large number of the world states, and it's pretty much the most countries in any treaty. However, there are some notable non-signatories. India, Israel, and Pakistan have never signed the treaty. North Korea did sign, but then later withdrew. It should be mentioned that South Sudan is also not a signatory, but they're a very new country, and they've been, I might say, rather busy with other things, so they haven't gotten around to it yet. So here are the provisions of the treaty. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but there's some key pieces that you need to keep in mind. Now, Article 1 states that each nuclear weapon state that signs and ratifies the treaty undertakes not to transfer to anyone any nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices to any other country. So the main idea behind Article 1 is that if you've got nuclear weapons, don't give them to anyone else. Article 2 states that each non-nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes not to receive nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. So here, Article 2 basically says if you don't have nuclear weapons, don't try to get them. And here then in Articles 1 and Article 2 of the NPT, you have the core grand bargain that was struck between these two different categories of states, each motivated by a different political objective going into the treaty-making process. Article 3 is significant for us because it's all about states accepting safeguards with respect to the treaty and agreement that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, will be established and in charge of overview and verification and inspection to support the treaty. So this is significant because if you're a party to the treaty, you've agreed to accept safeguards and the verification provisions of the treaty. We'll go into that in more detail in the future. Article 4 basically argues that countries, by signing the treaty, still maintain the right to develop, research, produce, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. It also states that they have the right to participate in the exchange of equipment, materials, and scientific, technological information for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Article 5 is a bit of a historical anachronism. It states that under appropriate international supervision observation, the potential benefits from any peaceful applications of nuclear explosions will be made available to non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty. Now, the reason for this is because this was a period in which people still believed that you might be able to use nuclear explosions either for major nuclear infrastructure projects or to gather vital data for using peaceful nuclear explosions, and that this information therefore should be allowed and disseminated. There really isn't the use of peaceful nuclear explosions anymore. So in many ways this article has kind of become historically irrelevant. Article 6 is a key article with respect to non-nuclear weapon states' motives because it states that the parties to the treaty will pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race and on nuclear disarmament, including complete disarmament. So again, that is a reflection of the motives of non-nuclear weapon states for coming into the treaty. You countries that have nuclear weapons, you sign this treaty, you are committing yourselves to nuclear disarmament. Finally, the treaty allows for the conclusion of nuclear weapons free zones. Okay, so here's the current state of play. This map shows NPT signatories and non-signatories. So the signatory countries are in blue and green, and the non-signatories are in red, and that includes Pakistan, India, Israel, and of course South Sudan. Now over here you will see North Korea. And of course, North Korea was a party to the treaty originally, but they withdrew, so they're in orange. Now, the criticisms of the NPT are many. The first and probably biggest criticism is the NPT is only binding on its members. So if you're not a member, you don't have to abide by the NPT. And you don't have to agree to IAEA safeguards either. So if you're Israel and you're India and you're Pakistan and presumably South Sudan, and the IAEA wants to inspect your facilities, you can say no because you haven't signed on to the NPT. Other criticisms of the NPT include the fact that some non-nuclear weapon states have developed nuclear weapons capabilities even while they were members of the NPT. And the examples include Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. All of these countries have developed significant nuclear weapons programs, and of course in the case of North Korea, actually acquired a bomb while they were members of the NPT, and that's not supposed to happen. So this is something that critics say the NPT has not been able to prevent. And in addition to that, many critics of the NPT say that the treaty members who have nuclear weapons have not fulfilled their commitment to disarmament. So the position of officials from Israel, from India, from Pakistan, when challenged on why they have not signed the NPT, why will they not commit the NPT into IAEA safeguards, they'll respond politically because the nuclear weapon states haven't lived up to their commitment to disarmament. And so when we see those countries commit to disarmament, then we will consider entering the NPT. But until then, we're not going to enter the NPT. And so you have this political stalemate between the countries that have not signed the treaty and those that have. And finally, one of the big criticisms of the NPT is there's a weak enforcement mechanism. What can the IAEA do if it detects a cheater, a country that is cheating under the provisions of the NPT, trying to acquire nuclear weapons, for example? All it can really do is sound the alarm. It's got no ability to punish, and it sounds the alarm to the United Nations Security Council, and of course you all know what that means. As a political body, it might act and it might not, depending on the politics of the moment. So this is another criticism of the NPT. But against that criticism, I think we have to be aware of the value of the NPT and of the IAEA. First of all, having it maintains the norm that nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons, is a security threat. That's a bad thing. We shouldn't want to see nuclear weapons proliferating throughout the world. And to the extent the NPT is sort of this normative barrier to that in order to acquire nuclear weapons, you'd be violating this norm, violating the NPT. That puts some political costs on the effort to acquire a nuclear bomb. A second reason I think we should value the NPT is that it does have worldwide systems of safeguards, and although a really committed cheater can circumvent those safeguards, it's complicated. It's hard. You have to invest a lot of resources, and so having this safeguard system just makes it a little bit more difficult to try to acquire nuclear weapons. And finally, the norm, this idea of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, is near universal. The NPT has more signatories than any other arms control agreement. And so it's as close to a global norm we've got that's enshrined in a treaty. And that's a fairly significant element that I don't think should be forgotten. Okay. So that was our look at the NPT. I hope now you are familiar with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and when asked by someone, you'd be able to describe it, describe its main provisions, and then be able to converse a little bit about what problems and challenges the treaty faces, but also why the treaty is regarded as a valuable piece in the overall arms control effort with respect to nuclear weapons. Okay, so that was the NPT, and again, it's kind of the cornerstone of so much of what we have been talking about, what we're going to talk about. So it merits a fairly detailed examination in and of itself. When we go on to talk about the NPT, I think one of the big questions is how can the NPT be made stronger, and is the NPT going to be strengthened, or is it going to be weakened in the future? I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you again soon.